March 7th, 1945. 3:55 p.m. First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann of the 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, 9th Armoured Division, stood on the western bank of the Rhine River and stared at something that shouldn't exist. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, a massive steel railway span stretching 1,069 feet across Germany's greatest natural barrier, was still standing. Every other bridge across the Rhine had been destroyed by retreating German forces, every single one. But this bridge, by accident, by oversight, by a series of failures so improbable they seemed like divine intervention, remained intact. Timmermann turned to his commanding officer, Major Murray Devers, and asked the question that would change the course of the war. Do we cross? The answer would put American troops on the eastern bank of the Rhine 3 weeks ahead of schedule, shatter German defensive plans, unhinge the entire Western Front, and set off a race to Berlin that would determine the shape of post-war Europe. This is the story of how a bridge that was never supposed to survive past noon on March 7th became the most important 325 metres in World War II. A story of impossible courage, catastrophic German failures, and a strategic windfall so valuable that both Eisenhower and Hitler would stake everything on its outcome. The Ludendorff Bridge was born from Germany's defeat in the previous war. Built between 1916 and 1918 during World War I, it was named after General Erich Ludendorff, architect of Germany's final offensives. The bridge was designed to move troops and supplies to the Western Front more efficiently, ironically just in time for Germany's surrender. The structure itself was a marvel of German engineering. 2 massive stone towers anchored each end, connected by 3 steel truss spans. The bridge carried a double-track railway line on its main deck with a wooden planked roadway suspended below for vehicle traffic. At 1,069 feet long, and rising 92 feet above the Rhine's normal water level, it was an imposing structure designed to withstand anything short of direct artillery hits. The bridge sat in a geographically critical location. Remagen, a small town of about 5,000 people on the Rhine's western bank, faced the village of Erpel on the eastern shore. The bridge connected them across one of the river's narrower points, where the Rhine was still 300 metres wide with currents that could reach 8 miles per hour. On both sides, steep hills covered in forest rose from the riverbanks, creating a natural defensive position. The eastern approach cut through a 383-foot tunnel, the Dwarf's Hole, bored through solid basalt rock. By March 1945, the bridge had become a vital escape route. As Allied forces crashed through the Siegfried Line and drove toward the Rhine, hundreds of thousands of German troops, civilians and military vehicles were streaming eastward in chaotic retreat. The Ludendorff Bridge was one of the last remaining crossing points. Every other span had been systematically destroyed as Allied forces approached. On March 1, 1945, Captain Willy Bratge, a 36-year-old combat engineer, arrived in Remagen to take command of the bridge's defences. What he found horrified him. The bridge garrison consisted of approximately 500 men, but calling them soldiers was generous. Most were elderly Volkssturm, the German equivalent of the Home Guard, men in their 50s and 60s with minimal training and ancient weapons. Others were teenage boys from the Hitler Youth, some as young as 15. Mixed among them were rear echelon troops, walking wounded from field hospitals, and various stragglers collected from retreating units. Bratge's artillery consisted of 2 20-metre anti-aircraft guns, a few heavy machine guns, and several Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. No tanks, no significant anti-aircraft defences, no reserves. The bridge itself was prepared for demolition, but the preparations filled Bratge with dread. Explosive charges had been placed at key structural points on both ends of the bridge. The primary demolition consisted of 600 kilograms of industrial explosives packed into chambers on the bridge piers. Emergency charges of 300 kilograms were positioned as backup. The detonation system used standard German military igniters connected to an electrical firing circuit. But there was a critical problem. The explosives were industrial-grade Donnerit, not military TNT. Donnerit was less stable, less powerful, and more susceptible to moisture. Worse, much of it had been in place for months, exposed to the Rhine's dampness. Some of the electrical wiring had corroded. The backup detonation system, a manual ignition using a friction fuse, was supposed to be foolproof, but even this had not been properly tested. Bratge requested permission to blow the bridge immediately, before American forces arrived. His request was denied. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, ordered that the bridge remain open as long as possible to allow retreating German forces to escape. The bridge could only be destroyed when American forces were within immediate striking distance, and only on direct orders from Model's headquarters. Bragg was given an impossible task: keep the bridge open until the last possible moment, then destroy it before it could be captured. The penalty for destroying it too early was death by firing squad for cowardice. The penalty for allowing it to be captured was death by firing squad for treason. He was a dead man either way. By March 6th, the situation had become desperate. The US First Army had broken through German defences west of the Rhine and was advancing rapidly. Thousands of German soldiers, horse-drawn wagons, civilian refugees, and scattered military vehicles were streaming across the Ludendorff Bridge in a continuous flow. The roadway was jammed with traffic. The railway tracks carried a constant procession of troops on foot. The scene was chaos, a defeated army in full retreat. That evening, Bratke received a visit from Major Hans Scheller, a Nazi Party official and engineer tasked with coordinating bridge demolitions in the sector. Scheller inspected the explosive charges and declared them satisfactory, though he did not actually test the firing circuits. He reminded Bratke that the bridge must not fall into enemy hands, but also must not be destroyed prematurely. Then he left, returning to his headquarters 15 miles to the east. Bratke spent the night of March 6th watching the endless column of retreating Germans. Around 2 a.m. on March 7th, he gathered his officers and told them bluntly, "The Americans will be here by tomorrow afternoon. When they come, we blow the bridge. If the charges fail, we defend it until we are dead. Dismissed." March 7th dawned cold and overcast. By mid-morning, American forces were within 5 miles of Remagen, but Bratke had no way of knowing this. German communications had largely collapsed. Field telephone lines had been cut by artillery fire or destroyed by retreating troops. Radio communications were intermittent. Bratke was operating blind, dependent on visual observation and occasional runner reports. At 1 p.m., a German army Hauptmann, a captain, arrived at the bridge with a column of approximately 1,000 retreating soldiers from various shattered units. He informed Bratke that American tanks had been spotted near Meckenheim, less than 10 miles away. The Americans were advancing faster than anyone had anticipated. Bratke immediately ordered the bridge traffic to be expedited. The Hauptmann's troops, the last organised unit, were rushed across. By 2 p.m, the flow had reduced to scattered individuals and small groups. At 2:30 p.m, Bratke ordered the bridge closed to all traffic. Now came the agonising wait. Standing orders required approval from Field Marshal Model's headquarters before demolition. Bratke sent urgent messages requesting permission to blow the bridge. He received no response. The telephone lines to headquarters were dead. Radio operators could not raise the command post. Bratke was completely cut off from higher authority with American forces closing in and no permission to destroy the bridge. At 3 p.m, Bratke made a command decision. He would prepare the bridge for immediate demolition and blow it the moment American forces came into direct view. He did not need permission to defend his position. The Americans would give him legal justification by their presence. He ordered the preliminary charges armed. The electrical circuits were checked. The manual backup fuses were positioned. Engineers stood ready at the detonation points on both sides of the river. Then they waited. The minutes crawled by. 3:15 p.m, 3:30 p.m, 3:45 p.m. Where were the Americans? What Bratke didn't know was that the American approach was not a planned assault on Remagen. It was an accident, a chance encounter that would change history. The 9th Armoured Division, part of the US First Army's III Corps, had been driving eastward through the Eifel region toward the Rhine. Their objective was to reach the river and establish defensive positions, while other units prepared for a planned assault crossing scheduled for late March. Nobody expected to find a bridge still standing. On March 7th, Combat Command B of the 9th Armoured Division, under Brigadier General William Hogue, was advancing along 2 parallel routes toward the Rhine. The northern column, Task Force Engermann, was moving through wooded hills with orders to seize the high ground overlooking the river. The southern column was following the main road toward Remagen. First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann's A Company, 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, was riding in half-tracks with the southern column. Timmermann, 22 years old, was a veteran officer who had fought across France and into Germany. His company had been in continuous combat for months. The men were tired, experienced, and increasingly optimistic that the war was nearly over. Nobody wanted to be the last man killed. At approximately 1 p.m, the column passed through the town of Biresdorf, about 8 miles west of the Rhine. Local civilians told American officers that the bridge at Remagen was still standing. The information was relayed up the chain of command. Brigadier General Hoger, sceptical but intrigued, ordered the column to proceed toward Remagen and investigate. If the bridge was intact, they were to seize it if possible. The advance continued cautiously. German resistance was scattered and disorganized. A few roadblocks were cleared. Occasional small arms fire was suppressed. By 3 p.m, the lead elements reached the heights west of Remagen overlooking the town and the Rhine Valley. And there it was. The Ludendorff Bridge, clearly visible across the river, completely intact. Officers grabbed binoculars and scanned the structure. They could see German soldiers moving on the bridge. Vehicles were crossing. The bridge was not only standing, it was in use. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engerman, commanding the task force, radioed General Hoger. "The bridge is still up. What are my orders?" Hoger's response was immediate. "Take it." Timmerman's A Company was ordered to lead the assault. His company would advance through Remagen, secure the western approach, and if possible, cross the bridge before the Germans could destroy it. It was a desperate gamble. Everyone knew the bridge had to be wired for demolition. Everyone knew the Germans would try to blow it. Everyone knew that being caught on the bridge when the charges detonated meant instant death. But the opportunity was too valuable to ignore. At 3:20 p.m, American tanks and infantry began descending into Remagen. The advance was swift and aggressive. German defenders in the town were overwhelmed. Most were elderly Volkssturm who surrendered immediately when confronted by Sherman tanks. Within minutes, American forces controlled the western bank and were approaching the bridge itself. On the eastern bank, Captain Bratch watched in mounting horror as American tanks appeared in Remagen. This was it. He shouted orders to his engineers, "Detonate the charges, now!" The German engineer at the western detonation point pressed the electrical firing button. Nothing happened. The circuit was dead. He tried again. Nothing. The wiring had failed, corroded by months of dampness or cut by American artillery fire during the approach. The engineer immediately grabbed the backup friction igniter, a pull cord device that would mechanically spark the charges. He yanked the cord hard. A sharp snap confirmed ignition. A sputtering hiss indicated the fuse was burning. In approximately 30 seconds, the charges would detonate. He ran for cover. On the bridge, Timmerman saw German soldiers suddenly sprinting away from the western tower, running eastward across the span. He knew what that meant. The bridge is going to blow. Get back! American soldiers who had been approaching the bridge entrance threw themselves flat or dove behind cover. Officers shouted warnings. Everyone braced for the massive explosion that would destroy the span and end any chance of crossing. The seconds ticked by. 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Then it came. A tremendous explosion erupted at the western end of the bridge. A massive column of smoke and debris shot into the air. The concussion wave rolled across the river valley. The bridge seemed to lift, its entire structure shuddering from the blast. Then the smoke cleared. The bridge was still standing. The explosion had blown a crater 30 feet across in the approach roadway, destroying the wooden planking on the lower deck and damaging the stone approach ramp. But the main structure was intact. The charges, weakened by moisture and improperly placed, had failed to collapse the western span. The bridge was damaged but still usable. Captain Bratch, watching from the eastern tower, screamed orders to detonate the main charges on the bridge piers. These were the primary demolitions, 600 kilograms of explosives that should have dropped the entire central span into the Rhine. The engineer at the eastern detonation point pressed his firing button. Again, nothing. The electrical circuit had also failed. He grabbed his friction igniter and pulled. The fuse ignited and began burning. Bratch ordered everyone off the bridge. German soldiers ran through the Dwarf's Hole tunnel, abandoning their positions and fleeing into the hills beyond. In 30 seconds, the main charges would detonate and the bridge would collapse. On the western bank, Timmerman and his officers watched the bridge through binoculars. They could see Germans running away. They could see smoke from the failed first demolition. They knew more charges were set to blow. But the bridge was still standing, and every second it remained standing was an opportunity. Major Murray Devers, Timmerman's battalion commander, made a snap decision that would earn him the Distinguished Service Cross. Cross the bridge, now, before they can blow it. Timmerman stared at him in disbelief. Sir, they've got it wired. It's going to blow. I know, Devers said, but right now it's standing. Get your men across before they can detonate the main charges. Move. Timmerman turned to his company. We're crossing. Let's go. The men of a company, 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, began moving onto the bridge. They advanced cautiously at first, expecting the structure to explode beneath them at any moment. Sergeant Alex Drabick, a 32-year-old butcher from Holland, Ohio, was among the first on the bridge. He later recalled, I thought I was going to die. Every step I expected the whole thing to blow, but I kept moving because everyone else was moving. You can't stop when your buddies are going forward. The American infantrymen spread out across the bridge, moving in short rushes, using the steel girders for cover. German machine gun fire from the eastern towers began raking the span. Bullets sparked off the steel structure. Men dove behind girders and structural supports. The advance continued despite the fire. Then, halfway across, the main charges detonated. A massive explosion erupted from the bridge piers. The entire structure lurched violently. Steel beams twisted. Concrete fragments flew. A huge section of the railway track lifted and crashed down. The roadway planking disintegrated. The blast wave knocked several soldiers off their feet. One man fell through a gap in the shattered decking and plunged toward the Rhine 90 feet below, before being caught by his equipment on a steel beam. When the smoke cleared, American soldiers began climbing to their feet, checking themselves for injuries. The bridge was still standing. Incredibly, impossibly, the structure had survived. The charges had been too weak, too poorly placed, or too degraded by moisture. The Ludendorff Bridge, built to German engineering standards that insisted on massive overconstruction, had absorbed a demolition attempt that should have destroyed it. The advance continued. Sergeant Drabick, leading the way, reached the eastern tower at approximately 4:00 p.m. He was the first American soldier across the Rhine. Behind him came the rest of a company, spreading out to secure the eastern bank. German defenders fled into the hills. Within 30 minutes, American forces controlled both ends of the bridge. Captain Bradge, his mission failed, gathered his remaining officers in the Dwarf's Hole tunnel. They had failed to destroy the bridge. Under Nazi military law, this was treason. The penalty was death. Bradge told his officers bluntly, "We are all dead men, but perhaps we can die fighting rather than against a wall." He organised a counterattack attempt, gathering approximately 100 soldiers for an assault to retake the bridge. The counterattack was launched at 4:30 p.m. It lasted less than 15 minutes. American forces, now reinforced by additional infantry companies and supported by tanks firing across the river, annihilated the German assault. Bradge's force was scattered. He himself was wounded and captured 3 days later. 5 of his officers were later arrested by the SS, court-martialed for failure to destroy the bridge, and executed by firing squad on March 13, 1945. Captain Bradge survived only because he was in American captivity when the SS came looking for scapegoats. By nightfall on March 7th, the 9th Armoured Division had established a bridgehead 1,000 yards deep on the eastern bank of the Rhine. Engineers were already working to repair the bridge and strengthen it for heavy traffic. Within 24 hours, the bridgehead expanded to 5 miles wide and 3 miles deep. Within 48 hours, additional bridges were being constructed alongside the Ludendorff span. American forces began pouring across in overwhelming numbers. The strategic implications were catastrophic for Germany. The Rhine River represented Germany's last major defensive barrier in the west. German planning assumed the Allies would require weeks to prepare a deliberate assault crossing with extensive air and artillery preparation. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge shattered this assumption completely. Now American forces were across the Rhine in strength, 3 weeks ahead of schedule, in a location the Germans had not prepared to defend. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, was at his headquarters in Reims, France, when he received word of the bridge capture. His initial reaction was skepticism. Staff officers had to confirm the report multiple times before he believed it. When the reality sank in, Eisenhower immediately grasped the significance. He contacted General Omar Bradley, commanding the US 12th Army Group, and gave him unequivocal orders. Get across with everything you've got. It's the best break we've had." Bradley immediately ordered the US First Army to exploit the Remagen bridgehead with maximum force. Within days, 5 divisions were moving toward the bridge. The entire operational plan for the Western Front was rewritten on the fly to take advantage of this windfall. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received the news of the bridge's capture on the evening of March 7th. His reaction was volcanic rage. He immediately demanded to know who was responsible for the failure. When informed that the bridge commander and several officers had already been identified, Hitler ordered their immediate arrest and execution. He then turned his fury on Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B. Model was ordered to retake the bridge at any cost or destroy it if recapture proved impossible. Hitler committed forces he could not afford to lose to a counterattack on Remagen. He stripped units from other sectors, including forces facing the Soviet advance from the east, and rushed them westward. Luftwaffe aircraft, hoarded for months due to fuel shortages, were committed to attack the bridge. V-2 rockets, previously reserved for attacks on London and Antwerp, were retargeted against Remagen. The German counterattack began on March the 8th and continued for 10 days. It was a disaster. Luftwaffe aircraft attempting to bomb the bridge faced overwhelming American anti-aircraft fire. Over 30 German planes were shot down in the first 48 hours. The attacks continued but achieved nothing. American engineers had thrown a smokescreen across the river valley, making precision bombing nearly impossible. V-2 rockets were launched at Remagen, but the weapons lacked the accuracy to hit a bridge-sized target. Of 11 V-2s fired at the Remagen area, none hit the bridge. One landed in the river 300 yards upstream. Others fell in nearby towns, killing German civilians and adding to the chaos. German ground forces launched repeated counterattacks against the expanding bridgehead. All were repulsed with heavy losses. American forces were flooding across the river faster than the Germans could respond. By March 10th, over 25,000 American troops were across the Rhine at Remagen, with hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces. The bridgehead was becoming an armoured fortress. The German High Command committed increasingly desperate measures. They deployed the Kriegsmarine's K flotilla, frogmen equipped with explosive charges to swim downriver and attack the bridge supports. 7 frogmen set out on the night of March 16th. All 7 were killed or captured before reaching the bridge. They sent floating mines downriver, hoping the current would carry them into the bridge. American engineers stretched heavy cables and nets across the river upstream, catching the mines before they could reach the target. They attacked with every aircraft they could muster, losing dozens more planes to American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Nothing worked. The bridge remained standing, and the bridgehead continued expanding. On March 17th, 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. The structure, damaged by the German demolition attempts, weakened by constant heavy traffic, and strained beyond its design limits, simply gave way. At 3 p.m, the southern truss span suddenly sagged. Engineers working on the bridge felt it shift and ran for safety. Seconds later, with a groaning screech of tortured metal, the entire centre span collapsed into the Rhine. The bridge that had survived 2 demolition attempts and 10 days of bombing finally succumbed to structural failure. 28 American engineers were killed in the collapse, crushed by falling steel or drowned in the river. It was a tragedy, but strategically it no longer mattered. By March 17th, American engineers had constructed 3 additional bridges at Remagen. Pontoon bridges and treadway bridges were carrying unlimited traffic. Over 125,000 American troops were across the Rhine with their equipment. The bridgehead was 20 miles wide and 8 miles deep, an impregnable position from which to launch the final offensive into Germany. The Remagen bridgehead became the staging area for the final American drive into central Germany. From this position, American forces wheeled north and south, encircling German armies and driving toward the Elbe River, where they would eventually link up with Soviet forces advancing from the east. Field Marshal Model's Army Group B, approximately 325,000 men, was trapped in the Ruhr pocket and forced to surrender in April. The capture of the bridge had split German defences and made coordinated resistance impossible. German generals later acknowledged that Remagen was the death blow to organised defence in the West. General Günther Blumentritt, former Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, stated in post-war interrogations that the loss of the Remagen Bridge meant the end. We could have held the Rhine line for months with proper preparation. Once the Americans were across in force, we had nothing to stop them. Our reserves were exhausted, our fuel was gone, our air force was destroyed. Remagen was the moment we knew the war was lost. The bridge that survived 2 demolition attempts, 10 days of bombing, and V-2 rocket attacks became a symbol of Allied determination and German collapse. But the real story was the series of failures, both German and circumstantial, that allowed it to survive long enough to be captured. The explosive charges were improperly maintained, degraded by moisture, and insufficiently powerful for the task. The electrical firing circuits had corroded and failed. The backup manual systems worked, but by then American forces were too close. German communications had broken down completely, leaving Bratsch without orders or support. Higher command had waited too long to authorize demolition, prioritizing retreat over denial, and ultimately the bridge itself had been over-engineered, built so massively that even partial demolition charges could not bring it down. On the American side, the capture resulted from aggressive exploitation of unexpected opportunity. Timmermann's decision to cross a bridge that could explode at any moment required extraordinary courage. Diva's order to advance immediately, rather than wait for reinforcements or artillery support, reflected the bold decision-making that characterized successful American commanders. Hoger's willingness to commit forces on short notice, and Eisenhower's instant recognition of the opportunity's value, demonstrated the flexibility and initiative that defined Allied operations. The human cost of Remagen was significant. American forces lost approximately 500 killed and wounded in securing and expanding the bridgehead. German casualties were far higher, including thousands killed in futile counterattacks and the 5 officers executed for failing to destroy the bridge. The 28 engineers killed when the bridge finally collapsed added to the toll, but the strategic value was incalculable. The Remagen crossing shortened the war in Europe by weeks, possibly months. It saved countless Allied lives that would have been lost in opposed river crossings elsewhere. It forced Germany to commit its last reserves to a hopeless counterattack, reserves that might have prolonged resistance if used defensively. And it demonstrated to the German people and military that the end was inevitable, accelerating the collapse of organised resistance. The bridge itself was never rebuilt. After the war, the damaged towers were stabilised and converted into a museum. The Peace Museum of Remagen now occupies the towers on both banks, dedicated to reconciliation and remembrance. The twisted steel remnants of the bridge were scrapped, but the stone towers remain, overlooking the Rhine where the most important 325 metres of World War II once stood. Sergeant Alex Drabick, the first American across, returned to his butcher shop in Ohio after the war. He rarely spoke about his moment of fame, deflecting questions with, "I was just doing my job." Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, who led his company across the bridge despite knowing it could explode beneath them, was promoted to captain and awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. He survived the war but died young in 1951 at age 28 from injuries and illness related to his wartime service. Captain Willy Bratger, who failed to destroy the bridge, spent 2 years in American prisoner of war camps. He was eventually released and returned to Germany, where he lived quietly until his death in 1984. He never spoke publicly about Remagen except to say, "I did everything possible to destroy that bridge. The charges failed. That is the only truth." The 5 German officers executed for the bridge's loss were formally exonerated by the German government in 1968. Their executions were recognised as judicial murders, victims of Hitler's need for scapegoats as his empire collapsed. Their names are recorded at the Peace Museum as a reminder of the human cost of totalitarian military justice. In 1969, a film called The Bridge at Remagen was released, dramatising the capture. While taking liberties with historical accuracy, it brought the story to a wider audience and cemented the bridge's place in popular memory. Veterans from both sides consulted on the film, and many attended the premiere. Former enemies reunited in memory of the day that changed history. The debate about what might have happened if the bridge had been destroyed continues among military historians. Some argue the war would have ended only slightly later, as Allied forces were preparing multiple Rhine crossings elsewhere. Others contend that even a few weeks' delay could have altered the final configuration of occupied Europe, possibly allowing Soviet forces to advance further west before the war ended. What is certain is that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge represented a perfect convergence of chance, courage, and consequence. A bridge that should have been destroyed hours before American arrival survived due to a cascade of German failures. American forces, expecting nothing more than to reach the river and establish defensive positions, suddenly found themselves with an intact crossing and the opportunity of a lifetime. Commanders at every level recognized the opportunity and acted decisively. Soldiers at the sharp end crossed a bridge they knew could explode, driven by duty and the hope that their courage might shorten the war. The secret bridge that won the race to Berlin was never really secret. It stood in plain sight, a massive engineering structure impossible to hide. But its survival against all reasonable expectation, its capture by forces who had no planned assault, and its strategic impact far beyond its tactical value, made it the most consequential bridge in modern warfare. On March 7, 1945, at 3:55 p.m., First Lieutenant Karl Timmermann stood on the western bank of the Rhine and asked if they should cross. The answer was yes, and that single word echoed through the final months of World War II, accelerating victory and reshaping the map of Europe. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen stood for only 10 days under American control, but those 10 days changed history. The bridge that couldn't be destroyed became the bridge that couldn't be stopped, and through it poured the avalanche that buried the Third Reich. The immediate aftermath of the bridge's capture triggered a bureaucratic earthquake through Allied command structures that would reshape the entire final offensive into Germany. Within hours of confirmation that American forces held the Ludendorff Bridge, staff officers at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were tearing up operational plans that had taken months to develop. The original strategy called for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group to execute the main Rhine crossing in the north, near Wessel, Operation Plunder, scheduled for late March. This would be a massive set-piece assault with extensive artillery preparation, airborne drops, and overwhelming force concentration. The American armies further south would conduct supporting crossings after Montgomery established his bridgehead. Remagen changed everything. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, saw the Remagen bridgehead as more than just a tactical opportunity. It was a chance to shift the strategic centre of gravity away from Montgomery's operation and place American forces in position to drive directly into the heart of Germany. Bradley had long chafed under what he perceived as Montgomery's cautious approach, and the British Field Marshal's tendency to claim credit for Allied successes. Now Bradley had his own route into Germany, seized by American initiative and courage, and he was determined to exploit it regardless of the original plan. Eisenhower, ever the coalition commander, faced a delicate political situation. The British had invested tremendous resources in preparing for Montgomery's Rhine crossing. Churchill and the British Chiefs of Staff expected Montgomery's operation to be the decisive blow. Simply abandoning or downgrading Operation Plunder in favour of an American thrust from Remagen could create serious Allied friction at a critical moment. Eisenhower's solution was characteristically diplomatic and strategically sound. Montgomery's operation would proceed as planned, but the Remagen bridgehead would be exploited simultaneously with equal priority. Both operations would receive full support. The question of which thrust would ultimately become the main effort into Germany would be determined by tactical success and enemy response, not by predetermined plans. This decision infuriated Montgomery, who correctly perceived that resources and attention were being diverted to support the unexpected American success. But Eisenhower was unmovable. The bridge had been captured. American soldiers were dying to hold and expand the bridgehead. It would be exploited to the maximum extent possible. Montgomery would have to share the spotlight. The race to reinforce Remagen became an exercise in organised chaos. American logistics officers, trained to plan methodical advances with careful attention to supply lines and road capacity, suddenly faced the challenge of funneling an entire army through a single bridge in the small town of Remagen. The town itself became an instant bottleneck. Its streets, designed for a population of 5,000, were now carrying military traffic that would strain cities 10 times larger. Engineers worked around the clock to improve road approaches, establish traffic control points, and construct bypass routes around the town centre. Military police directed an endless stream of vehicles: jeeps, trucks, tanks, artillery pieces, supply vehicles, and ambulances flowed in a continuous river toward the bridge approaches. The noise was deafening. The dust and exhaust fumes created a choking haze that hung over the valley. Across the river, the bridgehead perimeter was a scene of frantic military activity. Infantry units dug defensive positions facing east, preparing for the inevitable German counterattack. Artillery batteries unlimbered and began firing missions against German positions further inland. Tank units formed mobile reserves, ready to respond to any German penetration. Supply dumps sprouted across the captured territory as ammunition, fuel and rations were stockpiled for the coming offensive. Medical aid stations were established to treat the steady flow of wounded from skirmishes along the perimeter. Every soldier understood they were targets. German artillery fire began falling on the bridgehead within hours of its capture. Initially sporadic and poorly aimed, the fire increased in intensity as German forces brought up more guns. The bridge itself became a magnet for German artillery. Shells exploded in the river, sending up towering geysers of water. Others impacted on the banks, cratering the approaches and forcing engineers to conduct constant repairs. American counter-battery fire was immediate and overwhelming. Forward observers called down artillery fire on any German gun position that revealed itself. American artillery battalions positioned on the heights west of the Rhine had clear observation of German positions and ammunition in abundance. The counter-battery duel was hopelessly one-sided. German guns that fired more than a few rounds before displacing were systematically destroyed. But German gunners kept trying, knowing that destroying the bridge or making it unusable was their only hope of containing the American breakthrough. The Luftwaffe's attacks on the bridge, though ultimately futile, represented one of the most desperate aerial campaigns of the war's final months. German air commanders, operating under direct orders from Hitler and Goering, threw every available aircraft at the target. Fighters, fighter bombers, and even obsolete training aircraft were pressed into service. The attacks came in waves, sometimes coordinated, more often individual or small group efforts by pilots who knew they were flying suicide missions. The American anti-aircraft defences around Remagen became the most concentrated in the European theatre. Within 48 hours of the bridge's capture, the US First Army had positioned over 300 anti-aircraft guns around the bridgehead. Quadruple-mounted .50 caliber machine guns, 40mm Bofors guns, and 90mm anti-aircraft artillery created overlapping zones of fire that turned the airspace above the bridge into a death trap. Barrage balloons floated above the river, forcing German aircraft to attack through a specific altitude band where anti-aircraft fire was most effective. American fighter squadrons maintained constant combat air patrols over the bridgehead. P-47 Thunderbolts, the same aircraft that had dominated German skies for over a year, circled the area in relays, diving on any German aircraft that appeared. The Luftwaffe pilots faced impossible odds. They had to penetrate the fighter screen, survive the anti-aircraft barrage, identify and hit a target obscured by smoke screens, and escape back through the same gauntlet. Few made more than one attempt. Hauptmann Fritz Stehler, a veteran Luftwaffe pilot flying a Focke-Wulf 190, participated in an attack on March 9th. His after-action report, filed before he was killed 2 days later in another attack, described the experience. We approached at low altitude, hoping to avoid detection. As we crossed the Rhine Valley, the entire sky erupted. Tracer fire from hundreds of guns created a solid wall of light. Aircraft ahead of me simply disintegrated. I saw one machine explode, nothing left but debris. Another fell in flames, the pilot burning. I pressed my attack, diving toward where I thought the bridge was. The smoke screen made it impossible to see. I dropped my bombs blind and pulled up, my aircraft shaking from hits. Somehow I survived. 3 of my Staffel did not return. We accomplished nothing. The bridge still stands. Tomorrow we go again. Oberst. Joachim Helbig, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced bomber pilots, flew multiple missions against the bridge. Years after the war, he described the attacks as mass suicide. We all knew it was hopeless. The anti-aircraft fire was unlike anything we had faced. It was continuous, overwhelming, impossible to evade. The fighters were everywhere. We lost experienced crews, men who had survived years of combat, throwing them away against a target we could not hit. I survived by luck. Most of my comrades did not. The V-2 rocket attacks on Remagen represented one of the few times these weapons were used against tactical military targets, rather than terror bombing of cities. The V-2, Germany's revolutionary ballistic missile, was a technological marvel but a tactical failure. With a 1-ton warhead and a range of 200 miles, it could theoretically strike any target in Allied-held territory. But the weapon's guidance system was primitive by modern standards. It could hit a city-sized area with reasonable probability. Hitting a bridge was almost impossible. Between March 8th and March 17th, German forces launched 11 V-2 rockets, targeted at the Remagen area. The launches were conducted from mobile sites in Holland, over 150 miles away. The missiles reached altitudes of 50 miles during their ballistic trajectory, coming down at supersonic speeds that made interception impossible with 1945 technology. The results demonstrated the weapon's fundamental unsuitability for precision attacks. Of the 11 missiles launched, none hit the bridge. One impacted in the Rhine approximately 300 yards upstream, creating a massive waterspout but causing no damage. Another struck the town of Remagen itself, destroying several buildings and killing 6 civilians, all German. A third hit open farmland on the eastern bank, cratering a field. The remaining missiles fell scattered across the surrounding countryside, some landing miles from the target. Each V-2 represented a massive investment of resources that Germany could not afford. The missiles required specialized fuel, rare components, and complex infrastructure to produce and launch. Each rocket that fell harmlessly in a field was a waste of materials, labor, and technical expertise that could have been used for conventional weapons. But Hitler had ordered the bridge destroyed, and the V-2 was one of the few weapons that might theoretically hit a target beyond the reach of conventional bombers. So the launches continued until the bridge collapsed on its own, rendering the attacks moot. The Frogmen attacks represented German special operations at their most desperate and courageous. The Kriegsmarine's K-Flotilla, naval commandos trained in underwater demolition, were Germany's last hope for destroying the bridge after conventional attacks failed. The plan was simple in concept but suicidal in execution. Frogmen would enter the Rhine upstream of Remagen, float downriver with the current while submerged or semi-submerged, attach explosive charges to the bridge piers, and escape downriver before the charges detonated. The reality was that the Rhine in March was a cold, fast-flowing river with currents reaching 8 miles per hour. The water temperature was barely above freezing. Underwater visibility was near zero due to sediment and pollution. The Frogmen would be wearing primitive diving equipment, carrying heavy explosive charges, and attempting to navigate in complete darkness, while exhausted from fighting the current. Even reaching the bridge would be an extraordinary achievement. Surviving afterward would require a miracle. The first attempt was launched on the night of March 16th. 7 frogmen entered the water approximately 3 miles upstream of the bridge. They were equipped with closed-circuit oxygen rebreathers, dry suits, and explosive charges designed to be attached magnetically to steel structures. Each man knew his chances of survival were minimal. The mission was considered a one-way trip. American forces had anticipated this type of attack. Engineers had stretched heavy steel cables and nets across the river at multiple points upstream. Searchlights illuminated the water surface. Patrol boats with depth charges circled constantly. Machine gun posts watched the riverbanks. The defences were designed to stop exactly this type of attack. Of the 7 frogmen who entered the water, none reached the bridge. 3 were caught in the anti-swimmer nets and drowned, unable to free themselves from the equipment while fighting the current. 2 were spotted by American sentries and killed by machine gun fire. 1 reached the eastern bank and was captured alive, suffering from severe hypothermia. The 7th simply disappeared, presumably drowned, his body recovered days later miles downstream. The captured frogman, Hauptmann Hans Schrader, was interrogated by American intelligence officers. His testimony provided insight into the desperation of German operations. We knew it was suicide. Everyone who volunteered understood this. But if there was even a small chance of destroying that bridge, it was worth the sacrifice. Destroying the bridge would trap American forces on the eastern bank and allow our forces time to establish new defensive lines. It could have changed the course of the entire campaign. I failed. My comrades died for nothing. The bridge remained standing. That was the hardest part to accept. Not that we failed, but that our sacrifice accomplished nothing. The bridgehead continued expanding despite German efforts to contain it. By March 10th, 3 days after the initial capture, American forces controlled an area 8 miles wide and 4 miles deep. The perimeter was continuously expanding as additional units crossed the river and pushed outward. German counterattacks were beaten back with heavy losses. The German units committed to recapture Remagen came from desperate scrapings of remaining reserves. The 11th Panzer Division, a veteran formation that had fought from Russia to France, was rushed to the sector with less than 40 operational tanks and 3,000 men, barely a reinforced regiment rather than a full division. The Panzer Division, once an elite formation of over 16,000 men, arrived with fewer than 2,000 troops and 15 tanks. Various Volkssturm units, officer candidate schools and training battalions were thrown into the battle. These men, ranging from teenagers to grandfathers, faced American divisions at full strength with unlimited artillery support and complete air superiority. The result was predictable. The counterattacks achieved local penetrations that were quickly sealed off and eliminated. German casualties were horrific. Entire battalions were destroyed in a matter of hours. American artillery, directed by forward observers with perfect observation from the heights, fell with devastating accuracy on any German concentration. German commanders quickly realized that conventional counterattacks were impossible. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Lehr, reported to headquarters on March 12th that further attacks would result in the complete destruction of his division for no gain. He recommended withdrawing to defensive positions further east and allowing the Americans to extend their supply lines before counterattacking. His recommendation was rejected. Hitler's orders were explicit. The bridgehead must be eliminated regardless of cost. Bayerlein attacked again on March 13th, committing his last reserves in a desperate assault. The attack collapsed within 3 hours under overwhelming American firepower. Panzer Lehr Division, once one of Germany's premier armoured formations, effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. Bayerlein survived, surrendered in April, and spent the rest of his life writing about the futility of the Remagen counterattacks. In his memoirs he wrote, "We were ordered to attack an enemy who could bring down artillery fire that turned the earth into hell. We had no air cover, limited ammunition, and exhausted troops. The Americans had unlimited everything. The battle for Remagen was not a battle, it was an execution." By March 15th, the bridgehead was so firmly established that American commanders began planning offensive operations to break out into central Germany. The US First Army headquarters issued orders for Operation Voyage, a multi-division offensive to exploit the bridgehead and drive east toward the Ruhr industrial region and beyond. The operation would involve 6 divisions initially, expanding to 8 as additional units crossed the Rhine. The scale of forces assembled in the Remagen bridgehead was staggering. Over 100,000 troops with their equipment, vehicles and supplies were concentrated in an area approximately 15 miles wide and 8 miles deep. The density of combat power was unprecedented. Tank battalions, artillery battalions, infantry regiments and support units filled every available space. The bridgehead had become an armed fortress, impregnable to German counterattack and positioned to launch the final drive into Germany's heartland. Then, on March 17th, at 3:00 p.m., exactly 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed. Engineers working on the structure had noted increasing stress indicators throughout the day. Steel beams were showing hairline cracks. Rivets were popping from structural members under strain. The bridge had been carrying traffic far beyond its design capacity for 10 days straight. Thousands of vehicles, including heavy tanks weighing over 40 tons, had rumbled across. The structure had absorbed 2 demolition attempts, constant artillery fire, and near-miss bombs. The accumulated damage and stress had weakened critical structural members to the breaking point. At approximately 3:00 p.m., engineers noticed the southern truss span beginning to sag. Warning shouts went up. Men began running for safety. Some made it to solid ground. Others were still on the bridge when the failure cascaded through the structure. The centre span collapsed first, the steel trusses folding downward as supports gave way. The northern span held for perhaps 2 seconds longer before it too collapsed with a screaming sound of tortured metal. The entire bridge, over 1,000 feet of steel and concrete, fell into the Rhine in a massive cloud of spray and debris. The sound was heard throughout the valley, a thunderous crash followed by the roar of displaced water and the continuing clatter of falling debris. 28 American engineers died in the collapse, most crushed by falling steel or drowned after being thrown into the river. Another 93 were injured, many seriously. Rescue operations began immediately. Boats and swimmers pulled survivors from the frigid water. Medical personnel worked frantically on the injured. Bodies were recovered from the wreckage over the following days, some trapped in the twisted steel, others carried downstream by the current. The collapse was a tragedy, but strategically it changed nothing. By March 17th, American engineers had constructed 3 additional bridges at Remagen. A heavy pontoon bridge capable of carrying tanks was operational. 2 treadway bridges for lighter vehicles were functioning. Additional bridging equipment was being positioned for more crossings. The loss of the Ludendorff Bridge was emotionally significant. It had become a symbol of American ingenuity and courage, but its collapse did not slow the American advance by even a single hour. Traffic continued flowing across the alternate bridges without interruption. The German hoped that the bridge's destruction, even by structural failure, might slow the American build-up proved groundless. American engineering capability had simply bypassed the problem. Where one bridge stood, 3 now crossed the Rhine. Where 100,000 troops had crossed, now 200,000 would follow. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding the trapped German forces, recognized that the Remagen bridgehead had made his position untenable. His Army Group B, theoretically over 300,000 men, was being encircled by American forces driving north from Remagen and British forces driving south from Montgomery's Rhine crossing. The Ruhr industrial region, Germany's remaining source of coal and steel, was being surrounded. Model reported to Hitler that withdrawal was necessary to avoid complete encirclement. Hitler's response was to forbid any retreat and declare the Ruhr a fortress to be defended to the last man. Model, a loyal officer who had served Hitler throughout the war, found himself facing an impossible situation. He could obey orders and watch his army be destroyed in place, or he could disobey and attempt a breakout that might save some of his forces but would certainly result in his own execution for treason. Model chose a third option. He would obey the letter of Hitler's orders while doing everything possible to minimize casualties and allow his soldiers to surrender with honor. On April 1, 1945, American forces from Remagen linked up with British forces from the north, completing the encirclement of the Ruhr. Army Group B was trapped in a pocket approximately 70 miles wide and 50 miles deep. American and British forces began compressing the pocket from all sides, but they did not conduct a deliberate assault. Instead, they established blocking positions and waited. Inside the pocket, German forces were collapsing. Ammunition was exhausted, fuel was gone, food supplies were running out. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as an effective force. Communication with higher headquarters was lost. German soldiers began surrendering in groups, then in battalions, then in entire divisions. Field Marshal Model, watching his army disintegrate, made his final decision. On April 15th, he ordered his remaining forces to break up into small groups and attempt to escape eastward. He specifically ordered his officers to avoid further bloodshed and to surrender when continued resistance became pointless. Then he removed his field marshal's insignia, walked into a forest near Duisburg, and shot himself. His body was found by local civilians and buried in an unmarked grave. Model's suicide was not motivated by disgrace or cowardice. He was a competent commander who had fought skillfully under impossible conditions, but he had failed to stop the Allied advance, failed to destroy the Remagen Bridge, and failed to prevent the encirclement of his army. Under the Nazi code of honor and responsibility, these failures demanded the ultimate penalty, self-administered. His death spared him from watching the final collapse of the Reich he had served. The encirclement of the Ruhr resulted in the capture of approximately 325,000 German prisoners, the largest mass surrender on the Western Front. These men, many of them combat veterans from the Eastern Front, laid down their weapons not because they were cowards, but because continued resistance was pointless. They had no ammunition to fight, no supplies to sustain them, and no strategic purpose to their resistance. The war was lost. Everyone knew it. Dying for a lost cause served no purpose. The rapidity of Germany's final collapse from the Remagen breakout shocked even Allied commanders. Within weeks of expanding from the bridgehead, American forces were racing across central Germany against minimal resistance. Towns and cities surrendered without fighting. German civilians hung white sheets from their windows. Wehrmacht units dissolved as soldiers deserted and went home. The Third Reich, which Hitler had proclaimed would last 1,000 years, was ending in chaotic disintegration after just 12. The Remagen bridgehead's role in accelerating this collapse cannot be overstated. By putting American forces across the Rhine 3 weeks early, and in a location the Germans had not prepared to defend, The bridge's capture forced Germany to fight a two-front war in the west. Resources rushed to contain Remagen were unavailable to defend against Montgomery's crossing. Forces defending against Montgomery could not be spared for Remagen. The German military, already stretched beyond breaking point, simply fractured under the strain. But beyond the strategic and operational impacts, Remagen had psychological effects that resonated through both armies and the civilian populations. For American forces, the bridge's capture was proof that aggressive action and willingness to take risks produced results. The men who crossed that bridge, knowing it might explode beneath them, became instant heroes. Their courage inspired other units to take chances, to push harder, to exploit opportunities rather than waiting for perfect conditions. For German forces, Remagen represented the final proof that the war was unwinnable. If Germany could not destroy a single bridge despite throwing everything available at it, if German soldiers could be executed for failures beyond their control, if the Luftwaffe could be swept from the skies and the Wehrmacht encircled and destroyed despite Hitler's fortress orders, then what hope remained? The answer was none, and German soldiers increasingly acted on that realization. Surrender rates soared. Desertion became epidemic. Units refused to counterattack against hopeless odds. The will to fight, sustained for years by propaganda, discipline, and fear of the consequences of defeat, simply evaporated. For German civilians, the Remagen Bridge became a symbol of inevitable Allied victory and imminent occupation. Allied armies were across the Rhine, the sacred river that had protected Germany's heartland for 2,000 years. Nothing stood between the Allies and Berlin except distance. The Nazi regime's promises of miracle weapons and final victory rang hollow when American tanks were already deep inside Germany. The men who captured the bridge received recognition appropriate to their achievement. The 9th Armored Division was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation, one of the highest American unit decorations. Individuals received medals ranging from Bronze Stars to Distinguished Service Crosses. Congress passed special legislation awarding $10 bonuses to every member of the units that captured and held the bridge, a symbolic gesture but one that recognized the historic significance of their achievement. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann, who led his company across the bridge, was promoted to captain and later to major. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest decoration for valor. After the war, he returned to Nebraska, married, and worked as a school administrator. He died in 1951 at age 28, officially from natural causes but likely from health problems related to the stress and trauma of his wartime service. He rarely spoke about Remagen, telling his wife only that it was something he had to do and that he was lucky to survive. Sergeant Alex Drabick, the first American across the Rhine, returned to his butcher shop in Holland, Ohio. Local newspapers interviewed him extensively, and he became a minor celebrity. But Drabick was uncomfortable with fame, insisting he was simply doing his duty and that hundreds of others had shown equal courage. He declined most interview requests and refused to profit from his wartime experience. He died in 1993 at age 82, having spent his life as a quiet, humble man who happened to have made history. The 28 engineers who died when the bridge collapsed were buried with full military honours. Their sacrifice, coming after the bridge had served its strategic purpose, seemed particularly tragic. They had survived the initial capture, the German counterattacks, the bombing and artillery, only to die in a structural failure after the battle was essentially won. But their families were assured that their deaths were not in vain. The work they were doing when the bridge collapsed, strengthening and repairing the structure, had been essential to maintaining the flow of men and supplies across the Rhine. Their contribution to victory was real and recognized. Captain Willy Bratje, the German officer who failed to destroy the bridge, survived 2 years in American POW camps and returned to Germany in 1947. He was initially shunned by some Germans who blamed him for the loss of the bridge, but as the full story became known, opinions changed. Bratje had done everything humanly possible to destroy the bridge. The failures were technical and circumstantial, not matters of cowardice or incompetence. He eventually found work as an engineer and lived quietly until his death in 1984. He gave only one interview about Remagen, stating simply, "I did my duty as I understood it. The charges failed. That is war." The 5 German officers executed for the bridge's loss were formally exonerated by West Germany in 1968. Their executions were recognised as judicial murders, scapegoating by a regime that demanded impossible results and punished failure, with death. Their names are now listed at the Peace Museum in Remagen as victims of Nazi military injustice, men who died not because they failed, but because someone had to be blamed. The site of the Ludendorff Bridge today is a memorial to both sides, the stone towers on the Western Bank house the Peace Museum of Remagen, dedicated to reconciliation and remembrance. The museum contains artifacts from both American and German forces, personal items from soldiers who fought there, and extensive documentation of the battle. The eastern towers, less intact but stabilised, stand as silent witnesses to the events of March 1945. The Rhine itself continues flowing past the empty space where the bridge once stood, indifferent to the history that unfolded on its banks. On the 60th anniversary of the bridge's capture in 2005, veterans from both sides gathered at Remagen for a reunion. German and American soldiers, former enemies, embraced and shared memories. They laid wreaths at memorials on both banks, honouring the dead of both nations. The ceremony was attended by officials from both governments, who spoke of reconciliation, shared values, and the enduring peace between former enemies. One German veteran speaking to the assembled crowd summed up the feelings of many. "We fought here as enemies, young men doing what our countries demanded. Today we meet as friends, grateful to have survived and grateful that our children and grandchildren live in peace. That is what those who died here would want. Not continued enmity, but reconciliation and friendship. The bridge brought war. May its memory bring peace." The strategic lesson of Remagen, studied in military academies worldwide, is the importance of exploiting unexpected opportunities. No Allied plan anticipated finding an intact bridge across the Rhine. The opportunity arose from German failures, hasty decisions, and plain bad luck. But American commanders at every level recognized the opportunity and acted decisively to exploit it. From Timmerman leading his company across to Eisenhower, committing entire armies to the bridgehead, the Allied response demonstrated the flexibility and initiative that characterized successful operations. The German response demonstrated the opposite: rigid adherence to orders, unwillingness to acknowledge reality, and a command climate that punished failure with execution created paralysis at critical moments. Bratcher could not destroy the bridge without permission. His superiors could not give permission because they feared Hitler's reaction. When the bridge was captured, German forces were ordered to recapture it regardless of cost, rather than adapting to the new reality. Resources were wasted on futile counterattacks and impossible missions. The Luftwaffe was sacrificed in pointless bombing runs. Experienced troops were destroyed attacking prepared positions, all because the Nazi command system valued obedience and punishment over flexibility and adaptation. The bridge at Remagen stood for 10 days under American control. In those 10 days, over 125,000 American soldiers crossed into Germany. In the following weeks, that bridgehead became the launching point for the final offensive that destroyed German resistance in the west. The Ruhr was encircled, Army Group B was destroyed. The path to Berlin was opened. The war in Europe ended 5 weeks after the bridge's capture. While it would be simplistic to claim the bridge alone won the war, it unquestionably accelerated Germany's defeat and shaped the final campaign. The secret bridge that won the race to Berlin was never really secret, never really a bridge at all by the end, and never really about Berlin specifically. But it was real, consequential, and historic. It represented American industrial might, the ability to replace one destroyed bridge with 3 new ones in days. It demonstrated American tactical flexibility, the willingness to exploit unexpected opportunities. It showed American courage, men crossing a bridge that could explode while under fire. And it revealed the final bankruptcy of the Nazi system, unable to destroy what it needed destroyed, unable to recapture what it needed recaptured, unable to adapt when reality diverged from plans. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was built to last decades. It stood under German control for 27 years. It stood under American control for 10 days. Those 10 days mattered more than the previous 27 years. In those 10 days, history pivoted. The Rhine was crossed. Germany's last barrier fell. The final offensive began. And the Third Reich, which had terrorized Europe for 12 years, began its final collapse. All because a bridge that should have been destroyed hours before American arrival survived just long enough to be captured. All because American soldiers were willing to cross it knowing it might explode. All because commanders at every level recognised opportunity and seized it. The bridge is gone now, collapsed into the Rhine 79 years ago. But its impact resonates still, a reminder that wars are won not just by plans but by courage, initiative, and the ability to exploit the moments when fortune favours the bold. March 7th, 1945, 3:55 p.m. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann asked if they should cross. The answer was yes, and that yes echoed through the final weeks of World War II and into the peace that followed, a bridge between war and peace, between Nazi tyranny and democratic freedom, between the Third Reich and the world that replaced it.